fact that, right, so the title is Towards Interpretable and Trustworthy Prediction on Networks. So towards means it's work in progress. We've done some things. There's a lot more to be done, but I'm excited about this topic, and I'll tell you about some of the progress we've made so far. So first, let me acknowledge and thank my wonderful collaborators. This talk is largely based on two specific papers. One of them joined with Robert Londa, who was a postdoc of mine here at University of Michigan and GES, and he's now an assistant professor at Washington University, St. Louis. Tiffany Tang also was a postdoc. That's the second project, and she's now an assistant professor of statistics at Notre Dame. Both these projects I joined with Jiju, who also co-supervised both the postdocs with me and is a longtime collaborator of mine. The first paper with Robert is coming out in JASA, and the second one's still in preparation. So let me start with a little bit of a general background on networks. And I imagine some people in the audience are more familiar with it than others. It's been a very active area for the last now probably 15, 20 years. And I'll just give a very quick, brief general idea of what we're talking about. Network data to me, in the context of this talk, means data observed directly on relationships between entities. This is different from traditional multivariate data, where you observe data on one individual, feature vector traditionally. Here we know how they are connected. A lot of network analysis and a lot of statistical network analysis in particular has focused on just understanding the network, which is a very interesting and rich problem. Does it have communities? What are missing links and so on? And statistical models for it. But the reality of network data is it's rarely observed in isolation, just the network and nothing else. A lot of the time, we also observe the traditional features at the same time of the nodes in the network, sometimes also of the edges. And the focus of this talk will be a little bit different from trying to understand the network. It's just using the network information in solving other problems that we might want to solve, and in particular, prediction. Why could the network be useful in prediction in the first place? Suppose I just have this training data, I have the nodes, I have some response, I have covariates, I just want to throw it into my favorite, let's say, deep learning model and predict something. Why would the network help me? Generally speaking, one of the reasons the network may help you, and I want to emphasize, you don't know ahead of time whether it will help you or not. You have to learn that from data. But one reason it may help you is something called cohesion, which is just a generic term. I'm not going to define it mathematically, but what it means generically is that the nodes that are similar in some sense within the network, perhaps are neighbors or have friends in common, behave more similarly to each other than nodes which are not similar. In social networks, which is where a lot of this science originated, this is often observed empirically without any models. We just know this happens. Say you're studying high school students, you're trying to predict whether they will be doing some risk-taking behavior, for example, smoking, or drinking or something like that. And we all know that if their friends do that, then they're going to be a lot more likely to engage in that behavior. And arguably knowing what the friends do is even more helpful in prediction than knowing their individual covariates, demographics and parents' education and stuff like that. Now, causally, this is a very interesting problem, and I'm not going to address it, but I'll just point out that just because cohesion occurs doesn't mean we know how it occurs or why it occurs. It could occur because, say, let's take the smoking example, the students were both smokers already. And then they went outside to smoke and they met each other and they became friends. That's called homophily. Similar people become friends. The other possibility is contagion, which is more what we are thinking happens in high school, is all your friends are smoking and you start as well. So that's contagion spreading through the network. You cannot tell which one it was if you're observing it after the fact. And in fact, people proved mathematically in an older paper now from 2011 that from observational data, it is not possible to distinguish homophily from contagion. But my concern here is not a causal inference, is not figuring out why this is happening. I just want to use it to improve prediction. And so it doesn't matter why it's there. It just matters that it may be there, and then maybe it'll help me. Here is just one example to illustrate this idea. This is from a school friendship network data set. In this case, the smoking is of marijuana, but it's sort of true for anything like that. The colors of the dots in the network represents the age at which the student first started smoking. And so you see many of them never have so far, but the ones who have are clearly not randomly distributed through this network. So cohesion does occur. It's just a picture to have in mind for this. So let me now take a step back and set up the problem a little bit more formally. So what do I have here? I have three main things that I'm going to be using again and again. All observed and n observations, which in my network are nodes. I have a traditional feature vector, which could be, in this example, something like the students' age, gender, information about parents, their grades, etc., etc. That's X, and that's n by p. I have p features. I have some response, Y, which could be quantitative or categorical, doesn't really matter. I'll, for simplicity, treat it as quantitative, but either way. And that's what I want to predict. That's my response variable. And then, in addition, I have a network, which is represented by an n by n adjacency matrix A, and the entry ij represents the strength of connection between I and j. It doesn't matter whether it's binary, whether it's weighted. I will assume throughout this talk that it's symmetric. But even that doesn't really matter. It's just something that means that if the value of A is high, the nodes are more similar, more connected. So what are my goals in this setting? Well, first of all, predict response Y from X and also A, and of course, hopefully improving upon prediction from X alone, if the data in fact allows for that. I definitely don't want to make it worse by incorporating the network. Hopefully, I can make it better. Another goal is quantify uncertainty in this prediction. How sure am I of this outcome? And also, very importantly, for scientific applications, interpret the relationship, and especially the role of the network. Does the network actually help me? What's happening here with the network information? And if you think for a moment about how is prediction in networks different from just a regular prediction problem, it comes in through dependence in a way. Because typically when you set up your favorite machine learning algorithm and try to understand it, you typically assume that all the samples in your training data are IID, drawn from some distribution, and in particular, they're independent. The network tends to mean that training samples are dependent, right? These connections induce some dependence, however they do it. Is that good or bad? Well, depends. At least my immediate statistician's intuition says it's bad because I want independent samples, right? Dependence means I have less data effectively. My effective sample size is lower. So that is a bad thing. But there is also a good thing, which is if cohesion is there, I can use it. And that's an if, but it can hold. So that depends. So how have people tried to solve this problem? I'll give you two examples. But generally, you can think of it, the groups of methods, as one of two ways, general ways. One general way is regularization, and that means introduce a penalty. And we are all familiar with many different penalties that could be used for this purpose. Here is one simple example, and I really like the simplicity of it because I think it's easy to use as an illustration. This is actually also a paper by a former student of mine in G, Changxi Li, and us from 2019. And you can make it more complicated, but just to explain the idea, let's just say we're doing linear regression, basic linear regression of y and x. How can I add network information into linear regression? Through regularization. The way we did this was by introducing node-specific intercept. You can think of it as kind of as a random effect, but we're not treating it as random. We're treating it as an individual intercept. Of course, if you just do that, you cannot fit this model because it now has n parameters. But you can regularize, and we regularize by shrinking these individual node effects, if you like, towards each other if they're connected. That is what the penalty tells you. The cohesion penalty penalizes the difference between the individual effects if the nodes have an age. You can write it in this matrix form with a quadratic form with a network Laplacian. That's very familiar to networks people. To everybody else, it doesn't matter. So it's all quadratic. You can solve this problem in closed form. You can make the solution unique if you add a rich penalty. It's a very nice problem, and you can choose your tuning parameter by cross-validation, so you can, in fact, adapt to whether there is cohesion in the network or not. So that's one way, regularize. The other also very natural way is compute something from the network, compute additional features, and put it in your prediction model. These features could be very general. I'm going to refer to them as Z, which means something extra computed from A, or potentially could be from both A and X. What are some examples of those features? Some characteristics of the nodes themselves. For example, the degree of the node. The neighborhood averages. That could be very helpful, knowing the average value of X among your neighbors. And you can even use the average value of Y. There's a little bit of a consistency issue there, but you can. If you're just running regression, just add another column. You can fit other functions on the neighborhood. For example, if you're doing graphical neural networks, which is a particular type of neural network people do for predictions on graphs, you can use features constructed from that, and so on. The particular thing I'll focus on is node latent positions. And that typically comes from fitting a network model to the network data. So that's another huge class of models. There are many models in that class. Generally, how do they work? Well, you start from thinking, first you draw some random variable, which you don't see, that's a latent variable for each node from some distribution. And typically it's from a distribution in RD, where D is much, much lower number than N. And then from this latent position, you compute the probability of connection between two nodes, I and J, just depends on their latent positions, Zi and Zj, through some kind of link function. And then you just draw edges independently with that probability. This includes many well-known models. For example, the stochastic block model, which is very well studied, where these Z's are just labels. So it's discrete. It includes another very well-studied model called the random dot product graph, where Z's are vectors and the probability of connection is their inner product. So if they're close together in the latent space, then the probability of connection is high. You can, of course, use a link function there, like a logit or some other link function. And you can also make this kappa, this probability, a function of both X and Z. And models like that have been studied by Hoff and co-authors. I'm not putting a year there because it's a series of different papers, but these are from 2008, 2009, around that time. So these are well-established models. They're not always easy to fit. When you're trying to use both X and Z, typically they're fitted by Monte Carlo, but in principle, at least, you can write them down. So just to remind you of the goals, we're trying to improve prediction, quantify uncertainty, and interpret the relationships. And usually when I get to the point where I want to interpret the relationships, I have to do some kind of compromise and strike a balance. So that'll be for the second part of the talk. But for now, I'm going to focus on the quantifying uncertainty part, and I'll tell you about conformal prediction for network-assisted regression that we used for this. Now, a very short primer on conformal prediction, and I imagine many people have encountered it in some form. It's also been a very popular topic in recent years. There are many, many ways to do it. I'll just give you one simple one to use as an example, but you can substitute it with your favorite conformal prediction method, and a similar process will still work. So here is a classic method called split conformal prediction. You have your pairs X and Y. Important thing is they're exchangeable. And you have 2n plus 1, weird number of them, because you're going to use a half for training, a half for conformal prediction for sort of, let's say, validation. And then the very last point is your test point for which you're actually trying to get a prediction entry or a prediction set. And the goal is to construct the set for that very last point for which you just know X, you don't know Y, such that the probability of Y inside your confidence set will be above some confidence level. So how do people do split conformal prediction? You use the first endpoints to fit a model, whatever model you're fitting, you have your F hat. Then you use the second set to compute errors of your model. Generally, they're called nonconformity scores. They could just be absolute values of residuals for regression, or some other thing that measures how good your model is, trained in the first half, applied to the second half. And then the key idea of conformal prediction is all these things are exchangeable, all these errors. So if you just take the quantile of these nonconformity scores and construct your prediction set based on that quantile, you'll have the right coverage. So you find all the sets of Y, the set of all Ys where the error from X to n plus 1 will be under a given quantile. And the intuition is just because you're going to ranks under exchangeability, and ranks under exchangeability are uniform. That's a classic result. And so from uniformity, you can infer this coverage. So what if I wanted to do this for prediction on a network, if I was doing these extra network features? Well, here is the same exact algorithm modified to include the network. And the modifications are shown in orange. Everything else is exactly the same. So you can see I don't need to modify a whole lot. All I need to do is construct or estimate my additional network-based features. I'll call them Z hat because under the latent variable models, they may be estimated, not observed directly. And then just add them to my pairs of X and Y, which now become triples, X, Z, Y. And then I do the same thing. I fit a model on the first half, I compute nonconformity scores on the second half, and I take the quantile and I get my predictions set for the last test point. Now, am I allowed to just do that? Like, does that even make sense to just stick in network features? So that will be the first question. Is this valid? And when is this valid? And yes, the answer is that it is valid as long as we can have a suitable exchangeability within the network. So our task is to figure out what that means. Many network models are node exchangeable. That's a well understood property. it means the distribution of your adjacency matrix, the distribution of A, does not depend on what you call the nodes. So if the nodes were labeled 1 through n and I relabel them in some other random order, the distribution will not change. Invariant under any permutation. We need a little bit more than that here to apply conformal prediction, but what we need is also very natural and kind of naturally follows from this property. We need joint exchangeability of the whole thing. So we have X, we have Y, we have A, and what we're saying, take everything to do with nodes I and J. So their responses, their features, and their edge. And the distribution of that whole, in this case, 5-tuplet, does not depend on the order of the nodes. It remains the same under any relabeling. And if that is true, which for a lot of applications should be true, because the node labels are just arbitrary things assigned to them in your data set. It's true, for example, if your network was generated from a graphon model, which is a very large class of network models that people have studied. It's true if your whole thing is some sort of autoregressive model on the graph. This is a very popular model in econometrics, which also has been studied for a long time. Just everything is linear, everything is regression, but it's autoregressive in the sense that you have X and Y neighborhood averages appearing in prediction. Also true for this model. So true for many common models. So it's not that big a deal. Another very natural assumption we need is that whatever features of the network we're computing that we're going to add to the algorithm are also independent of node labels. And that makes sense because any useful node level summary should not depend on whatever number you assign to that. So latent positions have this property, node degrees have that property, neighborhood averages have that property. All the things that we might want to consider there. So as long as you have that, these two assumptions, which basically means joint exchangeability of everything you might use in your model, and we show that they're satisfied by many popular models, then conformal prediction, split conformal prediction, as I described it, remains valid. And the basic idea is that if you have exchangeability in the model, you can use it to show that your estimated latent positions or your estimated functions of the nodes is also going to be exchangeable. And then it remains valid. And as I said, we stated for split conformal prediction, but exchangeability is key. And so many other types of conformal prediction algorithms can be applied. We are also working on applying it to not just prediction of the response on the node, but also of the network itself. So predicting a missing edge, for example, and getting a prediction interval for that. That's currently in progress. In some ways it's harder, in some ways it's easier. It's just a different problem, but some of the same ideas can be applied to that. So that's one goal, at least partially answered, is uncertainty quantification for predictions in networks. Let me pause for a second in case there are questions on this part. Well, let me continue then. Another goal was interpretation. The conformal prediction by itself doesn't help with that at all. Just gives you an interval for your prediction. Doesn't give you any idea of why it's predicting what it's predicting. The true goal may be something like causal inference or understanding, is it contagion, is it homophily, etc. That's extremely complicated in networks. It's complicated even without networks, but in networks is especially complicated because of interference from your neighbor. Even inference on parameters, even though we are working on that in that setting of prediction, is quite difficult. There is a earlier paper by Lei and Lee, just for that simple regression case, for regression with network cohesion, where they did do inference, but under much, much stricter assumptions than the original method itself was. So it's not easy. So even that we don't yet have, but we can talk about interpretability, which is something towards inference, but not quite. So how are we going to do that in terms of prediction networks? What are we going to interpret? Well, whenever we talk about interpretability, usually we find ourselves somewhere in this space of compromise between powerful prediction methods and interpretability, right? If you think of the extremes, maybe you have linear regression on one end, which is easy to interpret, but maybe not as flexible. On the other hand, perhaps you have deep learning. Compromising, we're hoping now to do better than linear regression in terms of flexibility, but still have interpretability. We're going to start, and we won't stop there, but we're going to start with random forests. Why random forests? Well, they are flexible, that is well known. They do work quite well in a lot of settings. And in particular, if the data set is moderate in size, the training data set is moderate in size, they will often do better than deep learning, because deep learning does need a lot of training data. And a lot of these social network data sets, like the school network I showed you, are not that large. It's just one school, right? With maybe a couple hundred kids. There are a lot of applications where the data sets, just by their nature, are not super big. So we're going to try this here. Now, before we go on with the random forests, we're going to use one particular trick, which is it's basically an algebra trick. Once you see it, you can just verify it by doing algebra, but I think it's really cool and not well known. Now, some connection between predictions of trees and linear regression was known back to, I mean, maybe even earlier, but there's a paper in NeurIPS from 1997 by Peter Bartlett and co-authors, which used this connection, just saying if you get to the bottom of the tree and you have your leaf nodes, you can sort of do a type of regression on those features and reconstruct the prediction. We're going to use this other representation, much more recent, from a paper by Klosowski and Tian, who used it as an intermediate step towards some completely different goal. But it's a very nice little observation that if you fit a tree, a single tree, no forest here, just one tree, and you extract stump features from the entire tree, from every split, wherever it happens in the tree, and you just code them in this very simple way. It's a little variable with 3 values, which is either 0 if the value of x is not present at that split at all, or left or right with certain weights, depending on which way it goes on the split. Then you can just take those features, write them out, and you can recover the prediction of your tree by doing linear regression, regular ordinary least squares on those stump features, as long as your predictions are given by the average response in each leaf node. This is for regression. So this basically allows you to rewrite a given decision tree as linear regression in terms of very specific features that you pull off the tree. Now, why is that nice? It's because it gives us a bridge between linear regression and decision trees, and that gives us a way towards interpretation. So that idea has been explored in a paper on what they called Random Forest Plus. This is actually Tiffany Tang's thesis work at Berkeley with Bin Yu and other collaborators. That's kind of, she brought this idea to us when she came here. And what they did, this has nothing to do with networks, this is just a prediction algorithm, was define a new class of prediction algorithms that combine linear regression and trees. So they just do linear regression, but first they do a random forest, they get these stump features, and then they add linear features as well. Of course, if it's a forest, you have to do it for each tree separately, for each of the bootstrap sample, and then you average your final prediction across trees. There are various details on how you make it stable. You could restrict for computational reasons to use not all the features, but only the ones that showed up in the tree. If the problem is high dimensional, you can use other long loss functions and other link functions. That's all in their paper. But it's just this idea of using these stump features in linear regression that we're going to bore. So if we're starting from here, we're looking at this thing that has both linear and tree-based terms, and we think, okay, how can we add network information? Well, I can go one of the two ways that people have already tried. So I can use a cohesion penalty, this is the beauty of writing it as a linear regression. I can just stick in an intercept that depends on the node, because all I have is a least squares loss. I can use the same cohesion penalty and keep whatever other penalties they had before. So this is nice, but this does not include the network in the tree construction. The stump features are still learned purely from the relationship between X and Y. But that's one possibility. Another possibility is also do exactly what I showed you before, is let's say fit a latent variable model to your network. Say the random dot product graph or whatever your favorite model is, or you even do a GNN to predict Y from A, whatever you want to do. You get some extra features and you expand your original features with Z. And then with these new expanded features, I call them X tilde, you do the same thing. You train the random forest, you get the stumps, you fit linear regression. Okay, so there are two ways. And I could even combine them. I could do both, right? I could take more features and then add the penalty as well. And at that point, you might start thinking, well, that's getting to be too much. Why would you want to do both? Does it make sense? Is there a difference? And my initial reaction to this was, no, it doesn't make sense. But then we figured out that it does. And the reason that it does make sense to at least consider both is that they actually do different things and they achieve different goals. Cohesion, if you just look at that cohesion penalty, that's a very specific thing that it does. It suggests that your responses among network neighbors are similar. So if they're connected, then their responses are similar. Including embedding features is much, much more general. It means neighbors in the latent space are similar. Neighbors in the latent space could mean many different things. It doesn't have to mean they're neighbors in the network itself. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. So it sort of allows you to go for two different types of cohesion or of similarities that you could have in the network. Of course, the downside, as always, if you want to do more and more stuff in your model, you're going to end up with more tuning parameters because there are various things we'll have to choose. But that's more or less the price we have to pay. So one other detail that you have to take care of, to make predictions for test nodes, which are not available during training, if you have those. And sometimes you can treat it as, I mean, depending on what you observe, sometimes you just don't have Y. You already have the entire network, including for your test data, and then that's no problem. But what if you didn't observe connections to the test node when you trained? How do you fill that in? And here there are standard methods for these out of sample extensions for the embeddings and also for the latent space embeddings and also for network cohesion. And we're just going to refer to those and use those methods. I don't have time to go into the details, but it's a little bit awkward. This is a problem that does not occur at all in the regular setting when you're just doing normal prediction, because you don't have this question, well, what are my connections? But there are methods that people have developed to address this. So now to interpretation. There are a few specific questions that I want to answer in interpretation. Global feature importance, that's the traditional question. How important is a given feature in making predictions overall? Does the network matter? Another one is local feature importance. For this particular student here, does the network matter? Maybe this kid is easily influenced by their friends, that kid over there is not, right? This could vary. So we also want to know that. And finally, sample influence. Can we leave out a certain point and how much will it change? Is there a key, social influencer whom other kids follow? And is that person more important than others? So we have developed methods for all of this. Let me start with global feature importance, which is kind of the most standard. It exists for random forests, and they extended it for random forest plus, so we kind of borrow the same thing. Let's say we want to assess the importance of the network. Then we take everything that's to do with the network, and that's my node individual effects alpha, my latent variables, and also all the stump features that involve latent variables. This is convenient because every stump feature only involves one variable, so they never mix. My z's and my x's are always separate in the stumps. So I take all of those together as a block, I permute them, just as people do in random forest, and I look at the change in prediction accuracy when I've permuted them at random. You can look at permutation importance, which is change in prediction accuracy, or mean decrease in impurity, which is when they're just emitted from the model. These are sort of two standard ways to do random forest. Variable importance doesn't really matter. You can do whichever one you prefer. Of course, I can do it for covariates, just in the same way as I would have done it without the network. That's easy. But I can do it for the network as a whole, which is important. Now, for local network importance, it really becomes crucial that we did write this whole thing out as a linear model, because I can do it based on the sort of linear form. What I can do is I can say, what is the contribution of the network to prediction for a given sample? I can just zero out all the features, right? It's a linear model, so I can just set them to 0, they're not there. And I can look at what is that contribution on average among all the network points. Now, the absolute value of this quantity means nothing, right? I don't know what the scale is to evaluate this on, but relatively, I can find the point for which it's very large relative to average, or very negative, right? Very positive, or just typical. So that gives me some interpretation. And finally, influence, that's also a very linear regression thing. And because we wrote it as a linear model, we can actually even do it in the classical leave one out closed form solutions if we're doing it with the ridge penalty and everything is quadratic. For non-ridge penalties, we can do the approximation with influence functions, all classic stuff. And that's kind of the attraction of it. These things are well known. We know how to do them once we're in that space. Now, here we have to cheat a little bit because we're not going to retrain once we take something out because we've done the embedding. But at least empirically for interpretation, that does seem to work reasonably well. So actually, how much time do I have? Like 5 more minutes?
Yeah, you have 5 more minutes.
Okay. Well, let me just, I'll skip the details of the simulations. Simulations, as you can imagine, work reasonably well. I just want to show you a couple of things here. We've done 2 versions with the linear and nonlinear models. And what you have on the x-axis is the strength of the network effect. So when you're at 0, the network effect is absent. The network doesn't help at all. As you go to 1, the network helps more and more. So that's all you want to look at. And then the vertical axis is, let's say, accuracy. It's r squared. So high is good. So we compare 3 sets of methods. Each pair, the solid line is using the network. The dashed line is not using the network. Then the black one is ours. That's NERF, Network Assisted Random Forest Plus. The pink one is regression with network cohesion that I told you about. So that's a linear method. And the third one is somebody else's work called Network BART. It's kind of a Bayesian version of regression trees, and somebody derived a different way of doing it on the network. So first of all, on the linear model, if you look at NERF plus and linear regression, they both are doing extremely well because the true model is linear. So there is no reason for linear regression not to do it. And if you're using the network, accuracy basically stays constant, very close to constant, as the network effect increases. When there is no network effect, the important thing is also we don't lose. At 0, methods that don't use the network do as well as the methods that don't use the network. But then, of course, they start failing as the network influence is increasing, and we're not taking it into account. For the nonlinear model, when the truth is nonlinear, what you see is that linear model is not doing as well, except it actually gets better, which seems counterproductive, but that's because at the end, it's only the network that matters. It's only the cohesion. So it's picking that up and the model doesn't matter. But our model basically adapts to the linear situation, to the nonlinear situation, to the presence of the network effect, to the absence of the network effect. So kind of all the things that we wanted. This is also pictures of feature importance. In the simulations, it picks out the right features. No surprise there. What I do want to show you briefly here is, I'll show it in both plots, linear and nonlinear. If you look at the blue bars, that's 3 different kinds of network importance. Cohesion and embedding together is the first one, cohesion by itself is the second, embedding by itself is the third. So what you can read off a plot like this, and this is in fact exactly how the simulation was set up. It's the underlying network is a stochastic block model. There is no cohesion. There's only the latent variables that matter, and there are only 3 values of them. So the cohesion importance comes out very small, but the embedding importance, which is what's there in the setup model, it comes out high, and overall importance of the network is also high. So it kind of picks up those things, however you measure. So let me finish up with, I have 2 case studies, but let me skip to the second one, just kind of to illustrate how practitioners could use it for interpretability purposes. This is a study from one middle school where there was in fact an experiment done, and an experiment was conducting an intervention that was supposed to make kids friendlier and less likely to bully each other. The intervention was to invite them to a conflict intervention training. They couldn't force them to go, but they could invite them. And then, of course, it was self-selected who went, but that was the randomly assigned treatment. And then they had a bunch of covariates that they knew about the students, including a very important number, which is the friendliness score at the beginning of the school year before they did this experiment. And then they also measured the same friendliness score at the end of the year. And they also had the friendship network, which they collected from a survey of the students, just asking them who their friends were. So if you do all these things on this data and look at feature importance, and let's say I kind of prefer permutation importance here. Well, what do you see? Beginning friendliness is by far the most important thing, which makes sense. How that's probably going to be the most influential thing in predicting how friendly they are at the end of the year. Most covariates don't really do anything relative to beginning friendliness. The treatment is at least the second highest relative to covariates, but it's not that high. But you do see that the network is about as important as the treatment. Of course, there could be interference in that the friends decided to go together. That's why I'm saying this is not causal inference. This is just interpretability. But you see that the network shows up, and it is cohesion that is more important than the embedding, which also makes sense. It's your immediate friends that probably are a bigger influence. And here is an example of what you can look at in local features. You can, for example, look at local network importance. If you zoom in on this particular thing, local network importance has very dark circles there. It says that in this particular corner of the school, your friends are not that important compared to other places. And if you look at what the scores were that were observed there, they indeed quite variable. That's why the friends are not that important. So you can sort of zoom in and isolate certain places and even individual. Tiffany made a Shiny tool out of this. So really, if somebody really doesn't want to know anything about it and just wants to upload their network and look at these plots, they can. And I'll just wrap up now with summarizing. And this NERF plus method that we have proposed is a good middle ground between sort of marrying random forest and regression. It has really good prediction accuracy compared to what's available for prediction networks, and allows interpretability, not just globally, but also locally, of both the original features and the network. Just another disclaimer, we don't know what's causing what, but we can look at relationships. And as one step towards that, we are working on inference for models like this. That will hopefully help us establish a little bit more about this. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Levina, for your insightful and engaging talk today. So it's time for questions. So audience, if they have questions, can raise hand or put it in the chat box. I do not see a question at this point. So if there are no questions, I would like to take this opportunity of asking one question, actually from the first part of the talk, maybe a naive one. So the conformal prediction, as we know, is a more non-parametric way of predicting. Oh, actually, I do see a question. So let me take this question first. So it's from Glenn Satin. Question is like, how much computation effort does it take to fit your model?
Yeah, I assume it refers to this, that question refers to the second half, so this NERF plus. It depends. There is no, it's not a big effort to build embedding features unless the network is enormous. It's not a big effort to convert a tree to the stumps and build a model. So the computational cost primarily scales with the number of trees in the random forest that you're going to fit. And you know how many of those you're going to do, kind of like that's where your computational bottleneck starts. We found it doable, but you know this is computationally intensive. If you're going to especially do detailed cross-validation for the cohesion tuning parameter. If you don't bother with cross-validation, say if you fix it, or you know you do a rough grid search first or something like that, if you have a good guess about the estimate of your latent embedding space, that's another thing you could cross-validate for, but you could also just estimate it. There are many methods for that. Then it's not too bad. It's hard to give a, because you know there's so many things that vary here, the size of the network, the number of the features, and so on. Hard to give a precise answer. I see another question is, have you considered using other tree ensemble models like a GBoost? That's an excellent question. We have not, is a short answer, because we were so focused on being able to do it for a given tree, but I don't see why not, because the sort of the mechanics of this are applied per tree. So as long as you have a tree that you do this to, and then you have a way to combine the trees, it doesn't really depend on how you're combining them. So yeah, that's a good suggestion. That could be considered. Okay, Nilanjan, I think you got cut off on your question, but
yeah, no problem. So no more questions that I can see in the chat for now. So yeah, the point that I was trying to make was the conformal prediction is like a non-parametric way of predicting. So like theoretically, of course, is a very general result. But I was just wondering, like, if any sort of an empirical or based on simulation, have any comparison been done where some model-assisted prediction techniques have been compared with the conformal prediction to see, like, how the estimates are or how far off they are.
So yeah, so we haven't done it in this in great detail in this particular work, but I think in the conformal prediction literature, right, they have done this for certain things, for like regression and so on. So here we don't really have good alternatives is another issue, right? Because it's not like I have a model-based parametric prediction interval for regression on networks. Would be good to compare if we did, but this was basically, as far as I know, there is not really a model-based way of doing it. So maybe if there was a purely model-based interval, it could be better for that model. But there's just not a lot of options.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, is it applicable? I see another question in the chat. Is it applicable for data sets with high dimensions? Yes, to the same degree that random forests are, right? Because the underlying training thing is random forests. There are two different dimensions here we could talk about. One is the number of features in X. The other one's the size of the network. Size of the network can also be large. That could eventually create some complications in constructing the embedding and so on. It's good for prediction because you have more training data, but it makes the latent embeddings potentially more complicated. But yeah, I would say it inherits its relationship with high dimensions from random forests primarily. And I guess I assume it again, that question applies to NeRF+.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, I would like to thank Dr. Liza
Sorry,
Levina.
there is another question. Are the networks always given, and what if it is not given and you need to generate them? So I think what this means, let me just like offer my interpretation of this question, is and in reality this is often the case. I say the networks are directly observed. I measure them as observed, but how do we exactly obtain that number that we have observed? So for example, in the school study, we ask the kids a question: who are your friends? This is probably a noisy measurement of the actual friendship, right? It's not the truth. It's an answer to a survey question. There are many other applications, like in biology, when we're looking at protein-protein interactions, gene-protein interactions, there is some kind of weight, but it's a result of an experiment. It was computed from some measurements. It wasn't measured directly. Same thing is true in brain imaging. I do a lot of applications to neuroimaging where we look at the connectome of the brain, pretending it's a network, but that weight of the edges is something computed from, it's not generated from a model, but it's computed from other observations, or maybe estimated from other observations, right? Imputed in some way. So if that's the case, then all of this remains valid if you just say, I'm conditioning on those values, right? I'm conditioning on that realization of whatever random process gave me the network. If I treat that as fixed, I could do all of that. But this work is not designed to be a generative model for the network. It's not designed to estimate these weights. It's designed to use the network if it is available, whether it was observed truly directly or computed from some intermediate means. It's designed to take advantage of that information to do a better job in predicting and interpreting the relationship.
I think now it would be probably safe to assume that this was the
Okay.
last question. So I would like to thank Dr. Liza Levina again for sharing this wonderful talk with us. And I would also like to thank the organizers for putting this webinar together. I would like to thank the audience for attending this talk and making it successful. So we hope to see you all in the next edition of the seminar.
Yes, and thank you all again from me as well. And thank you for the great questions and good moderation.